This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Christina Knight, who teaches in the Department of Art History at Rutgers University. Christina received her Ph.D. in African American Studies from Harvard University. Her work examines the connection between embodied practices and identity, the relationship between race and the visual field, and the queer imaginary. She is currently at work on a manuscript, The Ship That Is the Body, The Middle Passage in Time-Based Art, which investigates contemporary Black American performing and visual arts that reimagine the history of the Atlantic slave trade. In this conversation, we discuss the place of expressive culture in Black studies, how embodiment challenges conventions and scholarship, the profession, and in the classroom, and how time and physics recalibrate our understanding of Blackness. Christina Knight, hello. How are you today?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you?
I'm really good. It's really nice to reconnect. We go back a handful plus years. Let's just say a few years. Pretend like it hasn't been a while. And it's just really nice to have a chance to connect with you and talk about your relationship to Black studies, hear about your work in the field, how you envision the field. I really have a lot of respect for the creative and analytical work you do, so it feels a little special to me to have a chance to sit down virtually and converse. So thanks for making the time. I really appreciate it.
I'm excited for the conversation. Honestly, you gave me my very first job, and I was in Black Studies, so this is kind of a full circle moment.
Oh, I like that way of putting it. I was part of the excitement of having you at Amherst College. That was a fantastic year. But before we get into talking about the field of Black studies, I wanted to start with really a more personal question, and just ask you to narrate a little bit about what got you interested in the study of Black life, what got you interested in Black studies. You have a Ph.D. from African American Studies in African American Studies, and so clearly something drew you to the field, something drew you to the study of Black life, and it has sustained you over these years. And so I'm interested in hearing like how you came to that and what keeps you connected to the field and to this way of studying.
For me, I guess it starts with performance and ends with performance. You know, I grew up in rural North Carolina, and for whatever reason, my family decided to put my sister and I in dance class. And so we were young dancers, and because we were in the rural South, we didn't have a ton of access to like big city dance companies, but every once in a while, we would see something like the Dance Theater of Harlem or see Alvin Ailey or Ron K. Brown Evidence. And I didn't have a lot of sort of a critical apparatus to understand what I was looking at, but it created in me a sense of wonder and a sense of belonging. And so by the time I got to undergrad, I started to develop a kind of apparatus to understand what I was looking at and why it mattered so much to me. So at Stanford, I did like really interdisciplinary stuff. It's like, I'm so amazed by that place because they kind of did away with core curriculum in the 90s. So you could kind of piece together your own course of study. And at the time, I pieced together a major basically that talked about Black performance and 19th and 20th century philosophy, and then Black history. And at the time, I got to work in Phil Goff's Race and Social Justice Lab, which was in the psychology department, strangely. But it was like the first time I was really understanding the kind of structural way that race works. And I was also learning about performance studies. So not just seeing performance, but learning about, how performance feeds into the way that identity works and vice versa. And so that became a kind of critical apparatus that then I brought with me, and a set of concerns and questions that I brought with me when I was looking for graduate programs. And then I ended up in an African American Studies department. It was sort of a hard choice because performance studies programs a lot of times didn't have a lot of faculty who were studying Black stuff. African American Studies departments didn't always have too much of an arts focus, and so you kind of had to choose. And then at Harvard, I kind of ended up, in the art history department along with African American studies. But I've always still been really invested in time-based art. That's kind of where the magic is for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting when you talked about that origin as a young person, as a child, that you said, there was something about seeing the kinds of things that you were doing, on the stage and that having an impact, a sort of identity moment. But I was really struck by that word wonder, right? I'm a philosophy PhD, so philosophers love to wax on and on about poetic or unpoetic about wonder. But I just want to ask, like, what was that? How would you describe that sense of wonder? Because I think that's such an interesting way to get drawn into the study of Black life.
I think like the way that I've come to understand it now is that for me, Black performance tends to open up a set of questions rather than answering a set of questions. So I remember very distinctly seeing a work by Ron K. Brown when I was at American Dance Festival when I was a young dancer. And it was sort of loosely based on the idea of the Great Migration, but it was like all these like kind of amazing couplings of like this mass of people. They were clearly making a trip. But there was this kind of sense of loss underneath the movement. It was clear that they were like leaving something. It was also clear that they were kind of world building and making new kinds of relationships. But at that point, I really didn't even know much about the Great Migration. And so for me, it like made me want to understand what this story was. It sort of opened up the investigation of what that moment was. And I think that can be a really powerful tool instead of sort of everything consolidating into an answer, just sort of this thing that makes you want to annotate, that makes you want to do further study.
Because that's what I was thinking is it was wonder about, I'm sure there was wonder at the spectacular bodies, right, and what they're capable of doing, but that's also that wonder to study. Right. I love that. That combination is really pretty amazing. It just would be, I mean, these things rarely happen in life, but, like it would be so amazing to like tell those dancers, hey, I was a little kid. This made me want to study as well as be a dancer,
I actually did get to tell Ron K. Brown that once.
Really?
Yeah, I told him because my graduate school essay was about seeing that performance. And so years later, I saw him perform again. And afterwards I said, seeing your company perform helped me realize that this is something that I want to keep studying. So that was actually a really lovely kind of moment.
That's amazing. I'm glad you got that. I'm sure he was like totally thrilled. What a thing to hear. Yeah. Well, let me ask you a little bit about the field. I mean, obviously, your doctoral degree is in African American studies. And so, you've been trained in that field as much as performance studies and art history. And so this is really a question about how you imagine the field today in 2024 and what it means to you, because it has such an interesting origin that has a tension built into it, right? There's the need and the demand for Black studies was about the failing of disciplines and the way disciplines hadn't studied Black life in any kind of serious way. And Black studies steps in to say, hey, there's an intellectual and expressive tradition here. It needs to be documented, and it also grows in this intellectual context. But it was also a deep political moment, right? It's right in that moment of radical Black liberation struggle after the civil rights movement that was reconfiguring relationships between study and community, right? And the politics of campuses and what surrounds them and the world as a whole, like not just local, but also global. And so, we're 50 plus years past. And so I'm curious how you imagine the field of Black studies yourself in relation to these origins. What do they tell you about the present, how we ought to think about ourselves and situate ourselves, but also maybe in ways that it needs to look different?
Sure, I love that question. I mean, I think I've come to realize after the fact that the way that I was taught about the field of Black studies is really that it starts with Du Bois, and I'm saying after the fact because, at Harvard, he's such a looming figure. And what I came to realize later is that means that I've always been thinking about Black studies in terms of its sort of intellectual project and less in terms of the kind of activist element. And I think that's it's neither here nor there. In terms of an intellectual project, I think like what the field does really well is that, it's always been structured by debates, like that was something that always really, really excited me. So like for every Du Bois, there's a Booker T.
Yeah.
There's not one way of articulating what uplift looks like for Black people. I've always been really invested in the idea of interdisciplinarity, like so exciting to be able to hold different kinds of disciplines together in friction sometimes and say like what can be gained, by not just siloing ourselves essentially. I think, in the last few decades also that the field of African American studies has done a better job of expanding its object. So, I was always trained that it's like literature and it's social sciences, and then we can sprinkle in culture here and there, but more and more I think the field is like, no, culture is actually really fundamental to understanding the Black radical tradition. I think like more and more I've been thinking about the role of Black studies in undisciplining, to kind of borrow from Christina Sharp. So I love the idea of interdisciplinarity, but I also like the idea that sometimes Black studies is like, maybe we shouldn't have disciplines at all, or maybe at least we should be thinking about how disciplines are coming out of the Enlightenment and are structuring the kinds of questions that we're allowed to ask. So I think that's really important. Also just in terms of like the activist piece, it's such a fraught time to be in Black studies, and it's such an important tool for students to have. But I also feel like there's a tension there between sort of what it means to want to be able to say the right things and be on the right side of things. And then the sort of work in the classroom of sort of destabilizing, right? So in African American art, a big part of like my syllabus is saying like, what is African American art? Like, is it about Black people who are producing the work? Is it about the subject material? Is it about a set of like aesthetic strategies? Is it a politics? And Black studies helps us realize that those are all moving targets, wanting to be able to rally, but then also wanting to be able to use this intellectual project to really make sure that we're being honest about what it is Blackness is and what it can mean.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, there's lots of stuff that we could talk really long time about. So many things in that comment. This notion of what we do with the word discipline, I think, is really interesting. And across these podcasts already, and we're doing this for a year, so I'm curious to see how it continues to develop. Like what we put in front of discipline is such an important. I don't know, it's like an antechamber into this whole thing, whether it's whether it's multi, whether it's un or anti, right? Anti-disciplinary or anti-disciplinary with an E. So I think these ways of thinking about like what is even going on in our collection of research materials, what's even going on in our constructions of a syllabus is its own kind of question that goes back to that origin of the field, as well as you were saying, like what does it mean to even say African American art literature, right? How is that political, not political? I love this moving target. I will cite you even in the classroom, but I love that moving target. And like, what do we make of moving targets? Is that imprecision, or is that something with really deep content? Like that's worthy of thought, the fact that it moves. Yeah.
Right.
So let me ask you then about your own work. What I like about your work, and you've already talked about a good bit about it, and hopefully have a chance here to talk a little bit more, is interested in the history of art, history of expressive culture, performance studies and its theoretical dimensions, and performance practice, right? Actually, writing and performing art. So I'm curious, when you think about your own work in the field, how do you think it's related to the history of Black studies? Like, what Black studies has done since, 1969, 1970, and what new horizons or pushing of boundaries do you think it's doing?
It's a great question. I mean, that I'm writing or trying to write or trying to complete a manuscript at the moment. And
you are finishing.
I am
Never
finishing.
try.
I am finishing a manuscript. And so, of course, when you're doing that work, you're in the intro, you're sort of articulating what this study is doing that other studies have not done, let's say.
Very weird moment in writing, by the way.
So strange,
It's like, let me talk about myself.
And, the ground that I'm breaking with my work. But so the book that I'm writing is called The Ship That Is the Body, and it deals with time-based art in the late 80s and early 90s. And I'm sort of thinking through two stories at once. So the first story that I'm telling through this art is about what I'm calling the performative turn in Black studies. So Black studies has cared about performance from the very beginning, but in the late 20th century, Black studies starts to take up the issue of performativity, which is, borrowed from gender studies, performance studies, this idea that we make identity through repeated action, and that also we kind of make the world that way. We make the world through our interpretive strategies. And so I'm sort of arguing that these artists, like as the field is developing this idea, and actually a little bit before, these artists are sort of enacting performativity in their work. And they're doing what I call like a kind of pedagogy of performance. They're instructing the viewer to their role in kind of co-constituting the world through their interpretive strategies and proposing that there might be other ways to remake the world. So that's one piece. But the weirder part of the book is that I'm also really invested in thinking about how these artists are thinking about time and how they're trying to deconstruct time. Because time as a kind of linear, progressive, causal, and even deterministic thing, that's an idea that we get out of the Enlightenment. And it's something that sort of props up, ideas of colonialism and slavery.
Yeah.
And so we know that like the way that common sense notions of time work are not how time actually works. So for instance, like a lot of time we think about time in a Newtonian way, like Michelle Wright writes about this. So cause and effect, we think about time as a constant, we're moving through it. That's not correct. Like even classical physics is sort of like, no, time and space or space-time, they're relative to mass, they're relative to speed. But by the time you get to like, quantum physics, like time basically stops working entirely. Like time moves the same way forward and backward, particles are in superposition, but until they come into contact with something else. And so like that sort of does away with ideas of causality. The world all of a sudden becomes kind of like indeterminate in a certain way. And so I guess what I'm arguing is that these artists are kind of getting us to think about time as it actually works in the world. So if Michelle Wright is talking about the physics of blackness, she's like using physics as a kind of metaphor to think about the capaciousness of blackness. I'm thinking kind of about the blackness of physics. Like there's something about blackness that helps us understand how the physical world actually works. Yeah. But in terms of your question about like how that relates to Black studies, it's like, I definitely inherited these ideas about Black performance studies. Like I inherited these really useful tools in thinking about like how we're remaking the world. But some part of me is looking to these artists for something kind of speculative, which is like, is there an afterlife to this performative turn? Is there a way to get out of this kind of endless citationality, which seems to only ever reproduce the kind of common sense that we came into? So is there a way to get off this ship?
Yeah. Yeah, no, God, there's so much so many interesting dimensions to this like shift in how we understand time, and then how it reworks entire stories of Black studies. Because, the way time is expressed, even just, you're talking about sort of the canonical way of constructing an idea of Black studies, starting with Souls of Black Folk, or, maybe people go before that with Du Bois, but starting with Du Bois is also itself embedded in this from slavery to freedom narrative. And I know people have tried to complicate that with the persistence of the slavery part in the era of freedom, around mass incarceration and policing and so forth. But that is in some ways still slowing down these notions of time or elongating them. But you're really talking about something completely different, right? So when I was hearing you talk and thinking about the question, like, how does it relate to the past and future of Black studies, or what boundary are you pushing? It's like, that's both a conception, a concern with how time is how we understand Black life, but it's also like none of these notions of time actually ever touch the nonsensical sense of time, right?
Right.
And even nonsensical, not in the derisive way, but in the way our sense is overturned. I mean, I remember learning in college about quantum physics, and I was like, who dosed my coffee? Like, I can't walk outside. I'm so scared to touch the ground because nothing is moving, as we say. But thinking about that in terms of both performance and also reconfiguring the entire way of thinking about all of our categories. I like to shout out to Michelle Wright, who hopefully will be on this podcast too. But
yeah, she's a hero, really, for me. So,
have you? I mean, did that mean you had to take time to immerse yourself in physics?
A little bit, yeah, just to make sure I'm not getting it wrong. And I've spent a lot of time with Karen Barad and sort of like feminist new materialist thinking, which is just like thinking about the kind of performativity of matter. But, Barad is trained as a physicist, so it's actually taken some time to make sure that I'm understanding what the science actually is behind what I'm saying. So I'm not misrepresenting essentially what I'm saying.
That's fantastic. That sort of grunt work of writing, just so that you can have, maybe some really key paragraphs.
Right.
I mean, that's what I feel like real research is, but that's also how you push boundaries, is to make these kinds of things responsible. I will, in my Glissant book, I do evoke, fractal geometry periodically, but I feel a little embarrassed about anybody asking me about fractal geometry.
Right. It's like you can ask me one or two clarifying questions, but don't ask me about the quantum eraser experiment. I'm just like, don't ask me that much.
But the way it allows you to see different things, that's what all theories do, right? Things that have been hidden in maybe the text that we have in front of us. Lives that we have in front of us. I love that. So I'm curious then, in some ways it's a continuation of this part of the conversation. You did your Ph.D. in AFM at Harvard, and you spent time in Black Studies departments, sort of right out of graduate school, and then you were in the Department of Visual Studies at Haverford, and now you're in the Department of Art History. So it's interesting to me to track this sort of movement, right, between, if you think of visual studies as an area study, and certainly African American studies as in a positive sense, area studies, multi-year undisciplinary studies, and then art history, which does have its disciplinary dimensions. It also has its undisciplined dimensions, I know. But I'm curious to hear you talk about how your own intellectual imagination has been impacted by this movement through different kinds of departments.
It's been a journey, honestly. I mean, I think you sort of learn something in theory when you're in grad school. So it was great to be in an interdisciplinary department. It was great for that to be accepted. That was commonplace. At Haverford, I was in the position to have to develop a curriculum around visual studies. And so then I was like, well, how does this work in practice? Like, if I want students to be doing interdisciplinary work, but I want them to be doing it well, because, you can do it sort of poorly because disciplines have a kind of orthodoxy and they have a kind of accountability within them. And so if you're just kind of picking and choosing, you're not necessarily doing the kind of ethical work of bringing those different disciplines together. So that was a big part of it. But also at Haverford, because we had such a focus on making, I was also trying to think about what role that should play in intellectual inquiry. So, like, what does it mean to be inside something? Like, what does it mean to make a visual object or to make a performance? And how does that sort of undo some of the ways that we theorize those things, but in really good ways? And then also the idea that, like, maybe we should be centering marginalized perspectives in the study of the visual, that's not the way that we've come to understand these things. Usually there's a kind of canon and then you just sort of stick on various kinds of difference. But instead, if you just like started with difference or alterity, like what would that do to the way that you study And, that was like, it was an experiment, and it's still something that's ongoing even since, I'm not any longer teaching there. It's been very interesting to be in a discipline. Art history can be a very rigid field, but I've found over the past couple of years that there are so many different kinds of art histories. There's different ways of articulating what that field is. Rutgers, I'm lucky, is very, very invested in interdisciplinarity. And in part, that had to do with how they constructed basically what my position is. It's contemporary African American. Contemporary art is kind of all over the place in terms of discipline, so you need to be able to track what various artists are doing. Medium specificity is out the window completely. But I think it's also been an opportunity, particularly in graduate classes, to sort of say, how do Black studies and art history talk to each other when they do, if they do? In my experience, they're pretty antagonistic, actually, to one another. Art history is founded on like connoisseurship. It's founded on a colonial legacy of looting, so Black studies has a lot to say about that. But I've also found that, we're in a moment where there's a kind of visual turn in Black studies. So many people are writing about contemporary Black art. Right. And art history actually does have something to offer that conversation because it's very invested in visual analysis. It's like, how closely are you looking at that object? I think sometimes, people are writing about stuff and they're not looking at it that closely, or they're just kind of using it to demonstrate something, but it's not really about the art object. So I like kind of bringing those things together and just seeing what that friction is. I think it can be really productive.
I mean, that's always the danger of especially theorists, the sort of excesses of theory. I use this as a self-criticism at times as a pure theorist, but also a check I put on myself is like, make sure you are looking at the object.
Yes.
I mean, I'm lucky to be partnered with a literature professor who is very much about the literary work as a literary work, and like you just can't get away from that. But you can also do amazing things in relation to it, and that's the way I think disciplinary stuff. I like the ideas of anti and undisciplinary, but I also love those moments of tension because as the way you articulated that, it really challenges us to attend to the object in ways that I should say myself, I can be really in a rush to stop talking about the object.
Right.
And start talking about what I want to say about it.
Yeah, the associations, of which there are many, but there's always something really juicy in the actual object itself.
I mean, did you feel any of those kinds of tensions productive and stressful when you were working as an African American Studies Ph.D. on visual studies, or it sounds a little bit like the visual studies thing was almost like in motion so much that it didn't have a pushback or tension or however we want to characterize it.
I don't know like how exactly I was articulating it when I was a graduate student. I think I didn't, because I was training in a field and not in a discipline, I was just doing my very best to like work with, a dissertation chair who was in an English department and then two readers who were in art history. And I was like, I'm just trying to get this text to a place where everyone can read it and feel like it makes sense. It was only really when I got to Haverford and had to sort of like say what it was that I was doing, and it was under this umbrella of visual studies that I was like, okay, this gives me an avenue to talk about this, and it actually expanded some of the ways that I was thinking because visual studies is also interested, for instance, in like the way the eye works, literally like, it's like the kind of science of that and how that's inflected with race, class, gender, the social ways that we see, like it just sort of opened up for me outside of just the purely aesthetic. It opened up some other ways of thinking about how our vision is structured. And then you can apply that and think through objects with that kind of lens. So that's been interesting to kind of then filter again through art history because art history has had a funny relationship to visual studies. There was a point in the early aughts where there was a really vexing conversation about like, what is visual studies? How does it relate to art history? And that's kind of gone out the window a little bit because we just don't have time. We just don't have time for that. There's too many problems with art history. We can't we can't make a villain out of visual studies anymore. But it still sort of sits with me. Those longer conversations.
There's also a point where it's like art being something that people care about is in such crisis. It might be time to bury some hatchets.
Thank you.
And
yeah.
actually
bigger
mount
problems,
a
bigger
love
fish
of this thing.
Yes.
That would be a humanities-wide problem, the novel, the critical essay, and so forth. I always wanted to be a theoretically minded art historian, but I'm colorblind.
No.
And it just absolutely derailed me. So as an undergraduate, so it's going way back. But Nick Damascus, I love Professor Damascus, but he was like, you can't see colors.
It's a little unfortunate. I mean,
It is. It does make for great jokes about being a white Black studies professor who's colorblind.
Doesn't see color.
The students always believe that they're the first to make the joke, but they're not.
Right.
But let me ask you more than this is a sort of big speculative question, or not really speculative, but big critical question. When you look back at the field of Black studies, I'm curious what you think that the field has done well, but also what you think it has not done particularly well.
That's a good question. I mean, I think it's done a lot of things well. It's made our kind of object of study bigger. So it means that like Black life all of a sudden matters. It's recognizable. It's tenurable in a way that it wasn't before. Yeah. I think that it's, and I've sort of alluded to this before, I think it's given us some tools to talk about the ways that we come to know things, our kind of epistemologies. It's also made a kind of safer space for some of us in the academy. When I think about grad school, this kind of tension between the art history departments and African American studies, like the African objects at Harvard when I was in grad school were still in the Peabody Museum, which is the anthropology museum, so. But not even just that, but just that.
That's wild. Okay. Wow.
Yeah. So, and
sorry,
now,
I got to catch my breath a little bit.
It's hard to think through, right? So, but it's just like these older institutions and the way that they think about Blackness. It was so good to have a department where there were other people who were studying Blackness. I didn't have to justify what I was doing. So I'm so grateful, I think in terms of what Black studies could be doing differently, I don't know if it's specific to Black studies. I think part of it is just that we are fixated on what our object is, and that has everything to do with what the academy is and what it demands of us. You got to say what Blackness is, you got to say what it does, why it matters to students learning about it, but then as a result, I think you kind of consolidate what the thing is. So I'm not sure how Black studies could sort of rise to this mandate of being how could we trouble the idea of the academy itself while still somehow getting funding.
Yeah.
That's the tension.
Yeah. I mean, thinking about troubling the object of our study, it just reminds me, just to be intra-podcast sort of reference, the conversation I had with Kianga Taylor, and she was saying in this around this, the way she hadn't used these terms that you had, but the object of our study, and troubling that. And she just said, what is Blackness? What is African American in 2024 when X percentage are immigrants and X percentage live here, and the emergence of different classes and regional differences? And I was like, okay, this troubling the object is, but how do we still exist as a department?
Right.
It's let's not talk ourselves out of existence. But, those are things that, English departments have done. What is literature? What counts as literature? But other departments, philosophy, my Ph.D. discipline, never really troubles its object. So those troubling of the objects, whatever we think of as the object, that's such fascinating critical work. And it does put the past under some scrutiny, but also I hope we can also not expect the past to have always done everything.
Right, right. Yeah, and can we move a little more nimbly? It's just, we're in such a tempo of emergency. I'm just is what we want to build something that has to last? I mean, I know that it feels wrong to say that because I want Black studies to survive. But on the other hand, I'm will anything survive climate change? I don't know.
Yeah,
so maybe we need to pack light in a different way.
I love that. Like move nimbly, not just always in the mode of emergency, even an emergency and maybe a little Erykah Badu shout out, pack light.
Yeah.
So I love that. So I'm free associating with that on that one, but I really love that nimble and emergency. I'm gonna be thinking about that for a long time. This conversation is already quadruply worth it. Thank you. So thinking about the future, right? The question of climate change is a particularly terrifying way of starting, but also where we all start with futures. But thinking about the future of Black studies, one of the things that has always been on my mind is, what would we actually cite as the success of Black studies, the ultimate success of the field? Because if it has this moment of, this origin point of correcting disciplines that had not studied Black life. And I think the presence of Black studies has changed disciplines hugely, especially literature departments. I think the study of Black literature is so central to most literature departments and even Romance languages, history for sure. Is the ultimate sign of the success of Black studies to ultimately have so transformed the disciplines that they're not recognizable to us now, or to what we have known. And so that in some sense, you don't really need Black studies because you study Black life in literature, art, history, philosophy, sociology, and so forth. Or is the success of Black studies really to be measured by our ability to be distinctive and non-absorbable by disciplines, to really be something kind of like its own discipline in some ways, maybe hopefully more open and erratic and errant and playful, but still something that can never be reabsorbed, to have so clearly defined itself?
I think I fall in it's troubling, I guess, to say it, but I think I fall more in the disappearance of Black studies camp. A few years ago, Jesse and I taught a class called Black Speculative Futures when we were at the University of Pennsylvania. And it was a weird class where we did, kind of somatic work, and we definitely studied a bunch of Black sci-fi. We did a bunch of Afrofuturism. But it was like also during, COVID times. And so everything was virtual. Everything was on Zoom. And so we decided, instead of making a big final performance like we had planned initially, what we decided to do is make this weird little film with the students. And the film was called Doomsday Field Notes. And the premise was that this anthropologist in the future gets this box, and, detailing this class that had met during 2020, which coincidentally was our class. But she's trying to figure out what it is that they're working on, because they keep talking about this Black feminist tradition. And, part of that moment was just, the title is Doomsday. So that, part of that moment was trying to think about, like, what's going to happen in 50 years. And so the anthropologist in the future is sort of thinking about, the fact that a lot of the academy's been destroyed. She calls this event that's happened the cataclysm, so we have no idea what that is as a viewer, but something has happened. But then there's this other element where she's trying to piece together what the Black feminist tradition is based on the fact that it's become so diffuse. It's become so much a part of how intellectual work happens 50 years into the future that we no longer are allowed to use terms like that. And so, I don't know if I would still make the same kind of film. I don't know if I would still dream the same kind of speculative future 5 years from now, 10 years from now. But I like that idea. It's sort of like Combahee River Collective. It's like, if Black women were free, we'd have done away with all oppression. And then we'd all be free, So it's like, so this vision sort of a future is one in which, like, everything has been remade such that everything is radically inclusive. That's the future that I want. That's not the world we live in right now. We desperately need Black studies now. And I'm not sure that there's a road from here to there. I don't know what that would look like. But that's still kind of what my hope is for the future.
And that's why I called it a big speculative question, because I like to liberate our sort of imagination around these kinds of things from the path in front of us, which is pretty dire. I think that's, to put it lightly, is pretty dire. But and I like that way of putting it. In some ways, for me, the question comes from the last I think maybe the last line or last paragraph of or a Richard Wright essay on Black literature, and he's like, we won't need when we no longer have Black literature, we'll know that Black people are free.
Hmm.
And part of that's because he's a sociologist in some ways with his literary work. I think Ellison was right about that. But I also think there's a deep thing there. Is like our vocabulary about what things like Black literature or Black studies will change if the world is radically different. I don't think Richard Wright, is like the most nihilistic person, in his writing at least. So like you said, that's not the path in front of us, but I love that as a way of thinking about it really in that speculative fiction and speculative play. I'm going to be thinking about that a lot. And, if you have a link to the film, I don't know if it's on your website, but
I can share a link, definitely.
Yeah, I'll definitely put that in the description so people can check that out.
Nice.
Well, let me ask as a last question, and this is less speculative and more getting a temperature on your sense of urgency. What do you think we in Black Studies, what is the thing that the question we should all be asking or the thing we should all be thinking about?
That is a great question. I don't know that there is one question that we should all be thinking about. I think, I sort of resist that question in some ways because I like how diffuse Black Studies is. I think that's the strength of Black Studies, is that there's a million questions that we are all thinking about, and that we've created this kind of loose and leaky container to hold all of that. That's the strength of Black Studies. That's why it's a nimble thing. I don't think that we should all be pointed in one direction necessarily. I know that's a little bit of a cop-out, but it's maybe truest.
The question is, why would you want to contain the question? Maybe
right. Yeah. So yeah, but it's an honest response. I'm even just looking at all the people that you've talked to in this podcast. And first of all, it's such a cool convening. I love that you're bringing together people who are senior and people who are grad students and people in the middle like me. But like we all have our own little series of questions, and I love that. I love that.
Yeah,
again, it's like a leaky cannon. I like that.
That's why I like these conversations. The people have such different, paths in, paths through. No one has a path out, but everyone has paths towards different kinds of depth. So I'm with you on that. The plurality is so exciting. I've talked with my collaborator, Ashley, a lot about how just in these first few months of doing the podcast, we just have actually very different thoughts about what the field of Black Studies is and is doing. Just because of exactly what you said.
Right. Even in the framing is hard. But I will say one thing, just as someone who has an embodied practice, I guess. The one thing I think all of us could be doing better is just like taking better care of our bodies and then figuring out how to do that in the classroom space also. Because sometimes I'm just like, why does Black Studies hurt? Like when I'm just sitting with a big
real
tome,
question.
And I'm thinking about what I'm teaching students about what Black Studies is. I'm making them sit over these articles. And that's okay. I want people to engage in study, and I want people to be able to be a little uncomfortable and still persevere. But that is one thing that's lingering for me as I'm aging, is just like, does this have to hurt? Like, could we find some more somatic ways to engage? Could we be healthier? That I really, in addition to this idea that maybe we all have different questions and maybe we all are pointed in different directions, I do think we could all be a little healthier and happier. We
certainly all appear in bodies in front of the classroom. We all are bodies in front of the classroom. No, I love that. I think that's a crucial question. I think we play around with it a little bit, but I think having, when we talk about self-care or something, but this is a little bit deeper. This is like, how can I be in my workspace in a different kind of embodiment? I love that.
And how am I disciplining my students? So instead of just being like, you should be caring more for yourself, like, are there sessions in which we're getting up and we're moving? Are we actually engaging other kinds of epistemes? Have we figured out how to not make everything about either succeeding or failing? Like, are we really remaking the institution through our course of study, or are we just kind of repeating the things that we've learned? And some of those are really harmful.
That's a great question to conclude on. Great challenge I think, for all of us to think about, like, for real. I love that. Thank you. And, I've always really liked the way you think. I like the way you see things. I like the way you make things. And so I was really excited for this conversation. It has been like much, much better than I even imagined. So this is like super thoughtful and interesting. I appreciate your time, and I really appreciate you really offering us so much to think about and ways to imagine ourselves differently in relation to the field of Black Studies, the classroom, to ideas, and to Tom itself. So I absolutely love that. A lot to think about. So thank you so much, Christina. I really appreciate everything.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad to be in the number.
All right. All right. Take care.
All right. Bye.